if I hadn't introduced myself, my name is Kathleen Smith, and along with Matt Duran, we're the directors, ringmasters for Higher Ground. And one thing, since I work in the government contracting security cleared community, I interact with a lot of people who are in public service. That's everything from admin, working in public policy, working in research and development. And it has been my pleasure to work with Bobbie on a variety of different projects. I just want to remind everyone in the back of the room, if we could keep our conversations down, to a dull roar, that would be really appreciated. So Bobbie has had a really great, interesting career. We're all talking about getting women more into security, into IT, into cybersecurity. So I want to have Bobbie sort of share her story of how she got into her career in cybersecurity.
It was a mistake. I would say it was a mistake, right? It certainly wasn't intentional in that regard. I graduated from a college a long time ago, and at a time when engineers couldn't find jobs. And people today think that that's a weird thing to say because engineers can find jobs right now. And so I found the first job that was offered to me because I was unemployed and didn't want to be unemployed for very long. And that turned out to be an engineering job in Arizona. And from there, it became important for us to secure this thing that was growing. I showed up my first day of work, and they were actually connecting the computers to each other. The network didn't exist at the time. Dot matrix printers were reality, and so through an odd set of fate and finding opportunities, I ended up in this security business and have really stuck with it.
So it's really interesting, but when Bobbie doesn't look any older than 29, but she's been celebrated for spending over 35 years in the government community. Starting with your job at what?
My first job in public service was with the Department of the Army, a very, very long time ago, and it was a really interesting place because it was me and the secretary and more guys than I can count in that space. So it was really...
And what was your last position in federal service?
I was the acting assistant secretary of the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at the Department of Homeland Security.
Pretty big job.
Yeah.
So what would people be interested in right now that you've spent some time working for an FRDC? Do you want to explain what an FRDC is?
Yeah, so I think this idea of the public sector is a bit misunderstood, right? When people hear the public sector, they sort of lean towards the federal government as their sort of first picture. And the public sector really is any place that identifies, influences, engages, or executes policy that improves the life of the American public. And in that are the federal government, state and local governments, federally funded research and development centers, universities, academia organizations. And I've now been in the federally funded research and development center community for a couple of years, and think about them as organizations that solve public interest problems that there's no market driver to solve. Right, so we do applied research to public interest problems that the market is not solving in a holistic sense. And that's what a federally funded research and development center does. And I've had the privilege of working both for research-oriented ones and engineering-oriented ones that really tackle all of these problems that exist at the seams. And that really sounds like cybersecurity, doesn't it?
So, for example, the energy community, what would be the various different public service entities that someone might be interested in a career in energy and public service?
It's a great example. So, you think about the energy sector. We have the policymaking and implementing organization in the Department of Energy. We have national labs, which exist to drive the technological foundation, the pure science side of energy. And there's some really amazing parts of that that going on. We have academic organizations that exist in that space. We have institutes, EPRI, EEI, and others that exist in that space that are about taking this pure science and reality and trying to bring them together in ways that the business models will work for and that the tech will work for, because the tech has to work too. And then you have the energy transmission and delivery mechanisms, which are largely also in the public sector. So most of the electricity production and transmission and distribution is run by, whether it be a government or a not-for-profit organization that serves the public's interest.
And right now you work for Carnegie Mellon, and I know that Carnegie Mellon has a variety of factors that are involved in cybersecurity. And you were explaining it to me the other day because I was getting confused between SEI and CERT and Carnegie Mellon. You want to sort of explain that a little bit?
Sure. So every federally funded research and development center has a parent organization. They either have a corporation that operates the center, or they are affiliated with a university that operates the center. And so in my case now, the Carnegie Mellon University operates the Software Engineering Institute, which is at the FFRDC, and then CERT, which has been, we say cyber was started in Pittsburgh. You think about the Morris Worm and the organization that was focused on responding to and helping really to grow the public side of this defensive and growth domain. That was CERT before the name actually existed in 1988.
So you've been in public service. It wasn't really something you possibly thought about, when you were going to school or when you were looking at your career. So what were some of the initial impressions you had, and what changed when you were part of public service that kept you in public service?
Yeah, that question of why do you stay is, I get that question a lot. Because, quick survey of the room, how many of you think that public service is fun? Right? Okay, a couple of folks. Most people have this perception of public service as being stodgy and difficult and boring, and there's not a lot of innovation in that space. And I've actually found it to be exactly the opposite. I fell into, I have a lifetime, both my parents are public servants, and so I have this sort of foundation piece of it. But I didn't have to stay. And as the market has grown, I've had many choices over time. But what I find is there's a phenomenal amount of innovation in this space, because there are a phenomenal amount of constraints you have to work within, right? You have to be unbelievably transparent. You are working in the public's interest in whichever role you play in that space. You are working in the public's interest. And the public is not one organization, one entity. And so you really have to think about what that looks like. And you're solving problems no one else is solving. And your success is measured against industry solutions that don't have to operate in the same environment. Now, I'm drawn to a really hard problem. This is a really hard problem, and it's a really hard problem that changes the world every day. And that's what keeps me.
So you don't necessarily think of public service as being innovation, but you definitely...
Absolutely. I have seen innovations in this space that that would not exist if we weren't here. Think about the kinds of environments that you have to operate in, whether it be if you're in the Defense Department and you're trying to put tech into domains where there is no tech, right? There's no radio tower there. Think about parts of the United States where there is no radio tower there, right? You really have to bring a sense of entrepreneurship and innovation into those problems. It is really, really an exciting space.
So what are some of the things people here, participants of BSides, should sort of think about if they wanted to consider going into public service? I mean, there are opportunities, but are there some constraints? Are there some things that they should be really thinking about?
So the couple of things that are true, and I resonate with Johnny's comments here, but a couple of things that are really true is when you work in public service, you are under a lot of scrutiny. And so you have to acknowledge that that comes with the problem space. If you want to work in cleared jobs, you've got to keep a lot of records. And you might not think about these records that you have to keep, but you have to keep a lot of records because no isn't generally the answer when it comes to these things. The answer is give me data. Right? When someone's looking at your life, the answer is give me the data about your life, and we'll start talking about how to get to yes. So if you're cleared, you've got to talk about foreign contacts, places you've lived, criminal records, travel-related activities. The ethics considerations are significant. When I left the Department of Homeland Security, and went into the FFRDC world, that was the first time I could ever attend a party at a conference.
She could go to Black Hat.
I can go to parties now, but I couldn't go to parties before because they were sponsored by a company. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's, it's a great opportunity, but I had to find ways to build my networks under those constraints.
And, what were some of the other career path constraints? I mean, there's a different way of moving throughout the public service.
So I think that's an important thing. One of the things that I hear at all levels of at all different varieties of public service, whether it be the federal, state, and others, is that the hiring processes are very prescriptive. They're very different than they are in that my industry counterparts have experienced. And in large part, fighting them is not going to be useful, right? Fighting them from the outside is not going to be useful. They are what they are, and the people you're dealing with don't have the latitude to change them. One of the most interesting things that I found when I was in government was that most of people inside government didn't even realize that the entire government doesn't operate under the same rules. Right? So the Department of State rules are different than the Department of Defense rules, are different than the Department of Homeland Security, than the Department of Education. And it's unfortunately more on the applicant to both understand them and to fit yourself into their knothole to get in the door. It's neither right nor wrong. It just is the way the world works. And you find lots of people on the inside just as frustrated as people on the outside in that space. But you really have to do that. And you have to take a real sense of ownership of your own career and navigate yourself and be really perseverant about it.
So it's take ownership of your career,
Absolutely.
No matter what, if it's private or if it's personal. So Bobbie has also worked with Bo Woods and Josh Corman over at I Am the Cavalry. She presented at Cyber 912 a few months ago. And we really were sort of talking about what could people who are applying for jobs, how could they help the process? What can they bring to the table and make a difference in any hiring process, not only public service, but private as well?
Yeah, so I find that being able to understand yourself, what motivates you, the passions is a really great thing to do it. That is as true in the public sector as it is in the private sector. Knowing what motivates you, shaping your presentation of yourself in a way that it's clear to the people on the other side on both what your skills are, what your motivations are, and what you bring to the table for the problems that are there. Meeting them more than halfway, I think, is really important. I find that when you get to the interview, let me say this differently. If you're looking for a job in the federal government or in state governments, what you put on that piece of paper is incredibly important. And everything you hear about resumes in the private sector is not the same as what you need in the public sector, right? You get 5 to 7 pages to be really clear about who you are and what you can do. That's a very different resume for me than the resume I have for work I do or want to do in the public sector. But bringing your passion into the discussion, I think, is really the most important thing, because in the end, the public sector is looking for that as much as anybody else, and that will win the day.
And we were talking earlier about sort of reverse mentoring and sort of we talk about this security talent gap, we talk about shortage, but is there a way that the participant, the job seeker, can maybe reverse mentor, reverse interview? What would be some of the things that they could do?
So I think I'm a huge fan of reverse mentoring. I think it's a really important way for the whole community to stay relevant. If you think about the world we're in right now in cybersecurity, we have 4 active functioning generations simultaneously in this workplace. And in the American workplace, that's not happened before. And so we have to have a good way to communicate with each other and to interact with each other. And your interview is as much of an interview of your potential employer as it is them interviewing you. And so you can provide to them input in that discussion about who you are and about what the world looks like in that space. And so it's as much an opportunity space for you to do that and bringing your authentic self to that discussion. I have found in the folks that I've interviewed gets more value than more stifled or stilted.
So we've gone over a variety of topics. Anything from all of the mentoring that you do? I mean, so far she's wearing one of the career blinkies, and you've already mentored a few people.
Yeah.
What are some of the key things that came out of your mentoring?
So one of the things that I hear a lot is there's a real gap in cyber skills in this environment. So people, why can I not get more traction, right? Why is it so hard for me to find a job? Because there's this sort of gap in the space, and so what am I doing wrong? Or why aren't employers just lining up at the door wanting me because I'm here? And I think the common theme that I've heard both today in many of my colleagues and friends as they think about what they want to be next is that it's really important for you to start from a position of knowing yourself and what motivates you, and then figuring out what the job is that will let you bring that to bear the easiest and the best in that space. And even today, that's been sort of a common theme. If you can't answer the question of what do you want, what kind of role are you looking for, what is your value in that kind of role, what would you bring there, it's really hard to even start.
Right. So you have someone here who has an amazing amount of experience. Any questions for Bobbie? And you're just going to have to stand up and scream them because do we have someone there with a mic? No, we don't. Any questions for Bobbie?
So over my career, certainly, let me go back. In the last 5 years, depending on where I've been, turnover has ranged from 3 to 18%. So in the federal government, it was not as great as I had expected it to be. It was about 11, somewhere between 9 and 11% at DHS. DOD, when I was at DOD, it was about 6% in that space. In the FFRDCs I've worked in, it's been about 6%. Where I am right now, we came from 18 and we're down. Retention is a key issue in this space, and retention is as much a culture problem as it is a benefit issue. And so you really have to think about the culture of the organization.
So when you think about retention, what kinds of principles do you really focus in on that seem to resonate?
So it's back to motivations, right? I find one of the things I have found is that a lot of people have taken what I call the shiny object route, and they've said, I make this much money today, and these guys have offered me this much money, and I'm going to go do this because it sounds really great. And then they get in there and they discover that the grass is just as brown there as it is where they are. And so I have found that being able to describe as an employer, being able to describe what the motivating factors of the organization are, right? What the impact are we trying to drive to, and lining up on motivations helps in most instances. And that's where I find a lot of people who are really passionate about either the data we have access to, the hard problems that are there, the thing that's never been done before, the ability to really innovate in that space really keeps people there.
So we now have a microphone. Any other questions for Bobbie? Great.
Hi, Bobbie. The question is, so for those contractors or people that are working within an institution but are not federal service employees but want to be, what kind of route can they take? And what kind of, because for USA Jobs, for instance, when you want to submit an application, what kind of keywords would you recommend using, relevant to the job description? And how can a contractor go about, going from contractor to federal service?
Right. So in the federal government, the truth is the federal government implements public policy as hiring policy. Right? That is just the reality. So everything from veterans' preferences to other preferences are an important part of the federal government there. And that means that even if you are sitting in the same space with a federal employee doing effectively the same job, you have no advantage over someone who's never had a foot in the door at the foundation level. Your advantage comes from your experience. And so so you just have to acknowledge that and realize that it's your job to present your experience in the best light possible. You also have to recognize that what the job posting is on USA Jobs is the target you are shooting at, even if it doesn't exactly match what you do every day going in the door. So the advice I tend to give people, and I am not a recruiter, so there are professionals who do this, but the advice I give people is, it's very old school. Print off the job description, take your highlighter, highlight in the job description the things you think are most important and most different. Those are your keywords.
And the other thing that I can say, as far as the difference between finding a federal job versus going in the corporate world, you actually have to go through HR and not the recruiting department, but the HR department first. You have to meet all of those requirements. And only once you've made it through there, which may take anywhere from 6 to 18 months, unfortunately, then you get to talk to the recruiter. So it's a little bit flip. Whereas in the private world, the recruiter is the person who is going to sort of say, do you get to go or not go to the next step? In the federal government, it's going through all of those policies, all of those USA Jobs, going through the HR department. Once they've said, okay, you meet all of this, then they will introduce you to the recruiter. It's just a little bit flipped.
And then the hiring manager is after the recruiter in the federal government. Right. So I don't even get your resume until you've met those two filters. But really read, that's your target. That job description is your target to get through those first two steps.
And if, Jim, do you want to raise your hand? So James Lint, who's back here, he's actually written a book on how to get a job in the federal government. He was going to present, but we didn't have enough space in our agenda. So if you have some more in-depth questions, I know that Jim is very happy to provide some advice. Right, Jim?
And he'll correct everything I got wrong.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank Bobbie for her time today.
Thank you.